Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about what we would call ontological models. So these are a little bit different than the four models that I've already introduced to you. Market capitalism model, dominance model, countervailing forces model, and stakeholder model. These ontological models look at normative choices or ethical choices. The four models that I've already introduced to you look at rational choice. And I think I mentioned this a little bit previously. Rational choice implies that actors can weigh alternatives and make some sort of a decision that's inherently in their best interest. Whereas these are looking at questions of right and wrong. Now, all of the models that I introduced to you before require that there are businesses, governments, and societies for them to be relevant. If there's not a business, government, society, they're not all that relevant. These ontological models, though, are relevant whether you're looking at people, God, the stars, governments. You can really use them in any context because you're looking at norms and values which we can assume, at least in these ontologies, exist independently of humanity. So, let's look at the first of our ontologies, and that is what we call the undifferentiated individual ontology. Now, the undifferentiated ontology takes what we call a metaphysical source, which I'm going to draw as 1 with a big letter O. Okay. So it's 1 with a big letter O. And what is a metaphysical source? Well, lots and lots of disciplines talk about metaphysical sources. You could talk about them if you look at philosophy. Plato would describe these as forms, and I discussed this a little bit earlier in my video discussing the kind of key terms and vocabularies for the study of business, government, society. So a form is an abstraction of moral, mathematical, or logical thought. If you are a scholar of Alfred North Whitehead, you might call these eternal objects. Okay? Again, they are, for purposes of discussion, we can assume an eternal object and a form are the same things. It's that thing in the universe that we don't exactly know what it is, but we could recognize it if we were ever to see it, although we probably never would see it. Those of you that like sci-fi or cosmology, we could call this dark matter. We don't know what it is, but it exerts some sort of an influence on us. It's that thing that we don't understand what it is. It is a moral value that we can never reach. It could be God. And of course, even around real things that we can touch, like a person or symbols, like for example a cross in a church, we add meanings to these people or these what we call sacred objects, like a cross in a church or a statue that might be worshipped. We can attach meanings to these objects or these people that also turn them into a metaphysical source. Okay? I'll give some examples in just a minute. So we've got this big one, okay, that's your metaphysical source, and underneath you have a bunch of ones with a lowercase o. So what are we trying to show here? We're saying that in the universe, there's some sort of a metaphysical source, this magnificent divine thing. We don't know what it is. And everything that we can actually see and experience in reality is some sort of an attempt to mimic or imitate that big one. Okay. So let's give a couple of examples to illustrate. And I'm not trying to proselytize anyone here, but think about in the Bible. We say that man is created in God's image. So God is this divine entity that we don't fully understand what God is or is not, but we try to imitate, to the best of our ability, whatever we think God is. Okay. And of course in this model, more faithful replications of the metaphysical source will flourish, And those that are deemed as maybe less faithful replications of the metaphysical source would in some way perish, cease to exist, or not be reformed. Okay? Let me give another example, and this is an important one. Sometimes these little ones, these attempts to imitate the big one, are actually nothing at all like the big one. Okay? Think of, for example, if you were to use a copy machine. And you've got that really fancy old school resume paper that was such a big deal back in the 90s, and you try to copy your resume that was written on resume paper, but it just spits it out in multicolored or just ordinary paper. Well, these new resumes wouldn't, they would be lacking something very special, something very significant from the original copy, because they'd be on, bad paper, and the original would be on good paper. So it tried to imitate that perfect resume on the perfect paper, but instead you just got ordinary resumes on quite ordinary paper. Okay? So just because we try to imitate the metaphysical source doesn't ever mean we will truly get there. Okay? Now if we start looking at this in managerial terms, think about in a corporation. You've got the CEO, who's this all-powerful, all-knowing being, or at least that's kind of the image that they try to portray to you, and everybody else in the firm tries to imitate or be just like the boss. Now those who fail, of course, are fired or not rehired, and those who are successful might actually one day become CEOs themselves. But of course, no matter how hard we try, we'll never be as great as the CEO, right? I mean, that's kind of the legend that they portray. In fact, we'll be very, very different than the CEO because we have different life experiences, different educational paths, etc. But we all try to be like that individual. So let's talk about some different theories that go with the undifferentiated individual ontology. The first is what we would call Republicanism. Now you'll notice as I'm giving theories on all these ontologies, they don't all come from business. Some of them come from politics, theology, etc. Again, these ontologies answer the biggest possible questions, and they are not specific to business. Doesn't mean that you cannot apply them to business. In fact, you should. So the first is Republicanism. And Republicanism, I just want you to note, has nothing to do with the American Republican Party. Nothing at all to do with that. It's actually a very old theory that comes from the American Revolution. And Republicanism basically was a tool used to mobilize the early colonists against the tyranny of the British rule. And it said, well, you know what, guys? We are all of British descent. We are all Protestant. We all want to be free from England. And of course, those of you who study history know that isn't really true. In fact, about 50% of the colonists wanted to remain part of England. There were many people in England that were not of British descent. In fact, there were Irish, there were Native Americans, there were Spanish, there were Dutch, there were all sorts of people, there were French, there were all sorts of people in the New World that were not British. And the idea that everybody was Protestant, well, that's not really true either. There were Catholics living in Maryland, there were Catholics living in other colonies. Of course, there were Quakers and Separatists and Puritans and all sorts of different kinds of groups. So it's not really true Republicanism, but what it does is it communicates to all these different little ones that there is this common thing at the core, this desire to be free, and the idea of free from British rule. And the idea was that it could kind of unify these different groups into kind of a single metaphysical source and therefore foment the American Revolution. Now, of course, we could use republicanism in other contexts. I mean, you think about at work, you may have a difference of opinion or maybe a disagreement with your office mate or your coworkers. You say, I know, but at the end of the day, we're all the same. We're just trying to make it through one day at a time. Well, I mean, that is some sort of a commonality that you can kind of use to unite your colleagues to work together despite their ordinary differences. So this is how republicanism can be used in a managerial workplace. You also have monism. And monism basically says that we need some sort of a moral authority, typically embodied in a person, to speak on our behalf. So some sort of a moral authority, typically embodied in a person, to speak on our behalf. Okay? We can't necessarily figure out the metaphysical source if someone decides it for us. Now, monism typically would look at taking individuals like a king, a queen, or a pope, and giving them some sort of a special moral authority to make decisions for us. And think about the Catholic Church. The Pope is a great example. The Pope is kind of the vicar of Christ and decides on moral issues for members of the Catholic Church. The Pope is that moral force, that metaphysical source. Think about the Queen of England. Okay, she represents some sort of a force for good for the British people. Okay? So she, in some ways, she has some sort of a moral authority, helping people decide what is morally correct or not. We also have statism. Statism is what you find in totalitarian regimes. Statism is the worship of the state, the worship of the government. So it is the state that decides what is morally right for all of the rest of us. That, just like monism and statism, they also have a corporate application. So in monism, you can think about it as, well, you know, the CEO is a role model that we should all follow. CEO is a role model that we should all follow, and we should all try to be like the CEO. That's how you'd apply monism in a corporate context. Statism can also be applied in a corporate context. Think about worship of the organization. You hear a lot of stories, for example, particularly in Japan, where people, we'll talk about the organization ethic a little bit later in this course, but you have people in Japan, for example, that will work themselves literally to death. It is this loyalty to the organization that everyone tries to follow. Monotheism. You all may be familiar with monotheism already. Monotheism basically says there is one God, and the rest of us are created in that one God's image. Now, typically we think of monotheism as a Christian or a Protestant kind of thing, but you know, there are other religions that also endorse monotheism, and this would be the ontology used to describe those monotheistic religions. Another one that I think is important is causation. I mentioned this briefly in a previous video, specifically for the market capitalism model. In this case, though, whereas causation before says there's some sort of an unmet market need, causation implies here that, quite frankly, people don't exactly know what they want yet, but I am a more faithful understanding of what people in a market need, and therefore I'm going to create some sort of an enterprise or an entrepreneurship to meet those needs that better embody the metaphysical source than these other firms that already exist. Okay? So we're not looking at market imbalances like we did in the market capitalism model for causation, but we're looking at a way of understanding that an entrepreneur is not someone who understands market imbalances, but the entrepreneur is someone who better understands right from wrong and creates some sort of an enterprise to better embody those kinds of values. Now, there are many ethical principles that do apply for this ontology, and we'll get into that during our ethics videos, but there's one more that you should be aware of. And that's ethical universalism. And ethical universalism basically states that there are certain things that are always right and wrong, and they're always right and wrong because kind of inherently in our DNA, we have decided that these things are always good and evil. So, you know, no matter what country in the world you go to, most people would agree that murdering is wrong. Okay? No matter what country you go to, there are usually some sort of immutable human laws that are always right and always wrong, and all of us in humanity should try to emulate those kind of universal norms or goods, no matter where we go in the world. Well, great. We are going to skip on our next ontology. We're going to go to the differentiated individual ontology and also look at some of the theories there. Looking forward to seeing you next time.